What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. Today we are going to be exploring how to make a halftime beat kind of like this. So if you like what you just heard, be sure to stick around because I'm going to be covering most of the major elements regarding this stuff. SENSEL sent me a morph, if you didn't know, and I couldn't have done this without them. Today we're going to be talking about some cool drum stuff that we did, and then also playing with the live macros that are regarding the bass stuff. And if you're brand new to the channel and you like the content, then maybe feel free to subscribe and like and stuff, or interact with the channel. It helps me out a lot. I really appreciate it. So halftime for me has been very elusive, and because I think the long story is like I've overcomplicated it by quite a bit. And it's very easy to overcomplicate things when you have an IDM neuro-based type of mindset, right? But really, in order to get something cool, you need a swingy beat, which we'll talk about here in a second, and then you need a bass that can, have a little bit of movement to it, which doesn't need to be that hard to do. Let's talk about the drums first. Now, what I did was I uploaded this factory kit called Aquario, and I just did a little bit of post-processing to it and shifted it a bit in the way that I wanted. There's a frequency shifter on here to kind of tune the whole drum set to F, as I've kind of dipped here, and then there's a little bit of dynamic EQ on this in order to not have this kind of like resonant tone. This actually makes a big difference. So if you listen to this kick on its own without this, I kind of wanted to take that out. And I think that the big perpetrator is that I'm clipping the heck out of it. So there you go. That's how I do some drums, and that's kind of all you really need. Everything else I didn't really touch. So that's all you have to do on that. Now, in order to get this kind of halftime vibe, in order to get this kind of halftime feel, what I would recommend doing is getting yourself some kind of pad or something, or, keyboard, whatever you have access to, and really just practicing listening and maybe trying to play along to these beats that you might hear in a halftime tune. So for me in particular, like I beatbox quite a bit. And if you guys have ever been in my streams and stuff, like you guys always hear that I'm like, and I'm like, all right, well, dang, how do I do that? And sometimes it's really difficult to do with a mouse because because you're moving one thing at a time. But when you kind of just let time go and you kind of just let things kind of flow in that way, then I do think that this is a skill that you can practice in that nature, something kind of like that. And so what I did was I kind of just set the metronome on to kind of help me out a bit, and then I kind of just bang this out, which sounds like this. Now, I have to be honest with you, whenever I first did this, don't think that it came out perfectly and everything was quantized and stuff. Even though some stuff is off grid, some of the major elements that I want to talk about are what kind of helps make this work when your notes are off time. So for one, the kick is always on the one. It doesn't always have to be on the one, but it really helps if you kind of have like a single bar or 2 bars at the most, and you kind of allow that to repeat, if that makes sense, at least every 2 bars, because that's going to kind of reset. And kind of the theory with rhythm is that as long as there is at least one element that repeats on the downbeat, then everything else can be kind of screwed off and, kind of like as abstract as you want it to be. And that applies to IDM as well. So within this, kind of one thing that I did was I did the kick and the snare first. And my kick was actually a little bit early, and so what I did was I kind of moved that to be back on grid, and then kind of shifted these over in that way. And I kept the timing between these two and kind of let that one come on as well. So you've got on beat, and then a little bit off. And as you can see, my snare is a little bit early. This kick is kind of the same thing. So I recorded 2 bars out, and you can kind of see that this is a little bit early as well. I think that I like to jump the gun quite a bit. So you can kind of see that everything kind of gets off a little bit and then catches back up in some cases or another. But I feel like this works in particular, even though it is off in some way. I don't know, for me it works, at least for now. So after that, then I re-recorded myself doing the ride, and I just kind of tried to play a little bit with it. So and then I tried to play at different velocities to try to get that off and on just a little bit, and you can see that sometimes I'm on, sometimes I'm off, and if like it's way off, this is okay. But if you get one that's like supposed to be here and it's like way over there, then just drag it and kind of align it with your snare, and then you should be okay, or align it with whatever fundamental you have, right? So that kind of takes care of the drums. I know that that's kind of an abstract way to do this, but I really think that practicing swing is a great way to do things. When people say like work off grid, that's kind of like what you want to think about is, instead of putting everything off grid, pick some of the main parts of the rhythm, mainly the downbeat, and then maybe like every other snare or something, and just use that as a frame of reference, and then kind of just play around with everything being a little bit off or a little bit on. And then if worst case scenario, you can always go back. This is a really hard skill, especially for me. I think that I actually looked out with this one, but I think that obtaining that particular kind of beat, there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can go watch this other video that I have for a bunch of different boom bap / halftime beats in this thing here with the keyboard and mouse. It's a different vibe though, right? Okay. So the next thing that we have is our main bass. It's just one layer, but there's a lot of different elements to it. So this is what it sounds like on its own. Now this one is really fun because I've mapped some macros over to here, and I've kind of allowed myself to kind of play with these, and that way if I wanted to do this live or whatever, then I can kind of just mess around. And one thing that I wanted to like bring this on board for is because if you're working in with Bitwig, then the way that you get these macros to work is by creating these macros here outside of this, because if you just have those by themselves, then it won't work. So what you need to do is kind of just allow yourself to go here, and then you would go to like add a new page and then just find the macros, which there's pretty much the cool thing, but also the bad thing about Faceplan is that you only have access to the macros as far as like the modularity goes. So I think it actually works in my favor for this particular use case. So for the actual patch, I kind of just started with a square wave, to be honest. And I think that I turned everything else off other than the distortion and stuff, and just started with a low pass filter that had an envelope on it. And that kind of sounded like this. And then I was like, oh, it'll be kind of cool to bite off of, you know, somebody like EPROM or something. Not that I'm anywhere near good as him or anything, but it would be kind of cool if I set up some macros in order to make some changes. And so what I did after applying the filter was I added another analog synthesizer that was an octave up. And then what I did was I learned a cool trick from Databroth, which was doing some cool AM or RM and applying that into here. And the only thing that I did was, as I started making these changes or adding these additions, I kind of just mapped those two specific macros. And this is kind of an efficient way to work, because if you think about doing it in this way, then you're able to, one, keep track of what you're doing with the patch, but two, you're allowing yourself to have a dry wet knob on up to 8 different macros, right? And so I think that this in particular worked out. So some other things that I mapped were the detuning on here. So the detuning is kind of in this way. And then I've also done sync on both, which is linked up to here. And then this just dictates the amplitude of the second analog. And this is the RM amount. So that's pretty much it. Other than just having like some basic compression, if we open up this right here, I've got the sub and mono that I'm boosting the low a little bit. And then I've got a Haas effect right here. There is a little bit of reverb on here, or at least there was. There was a little bit of reverb on here. I guess I got rid of it. You can add that too if you want, and if you want just a little bit more space in that way. So this originally was intended to kind of like, if you notice, like if I play this, that kind of gets significantly louder, but I think that just by having some compression at the end and then doing a little bit of mixing towards like the end of the, I guess, beat phase, or like when you actually get into the mixing stage, then you can kind of correct those things. But just be mindful of that. I think that it's because of the peaking of the filter, but there you have it. So that's pretty much the bass patch. Pretty simple, right? So the next thing that we have is a really cool trick that I have talked about before on a bunch of videos. I don't have a dedicated video to this, but that's why you're watching this video, because you get some cool tricks, right? So what I do within Vital, Vital and Serum are pretty much my shaker slaves because I don't really use them for anything else. I can, but it's so fast and I don't know. Leave me alone, okay? But what you do is you activate the sample function, and then that will pull up some noise. And so you apply LFO1 to the level here. And what I've kind of allowed myself to do though, instead, to make this a little bit more interesting, is that I've LFO'd an LFO. So instead of this just playing this right here, let me bypass this for just a second. So if you listen to this, then that's pretty much it. And one really big reason why I like Vital so much for shakers is because of the multi-stage envelope. You can kind of shape your own and make them as swingy or as on beat or kind of whatever as you want. And there's a lot of different things that you can do if you kind of actually apply actual shaker samples into this. I just use the noise because I'm lazy, but that's how you kind of do that. So once you activate the second one, you'll see here that I've kind of have this rounded square shape. And the reason why is because if you listen to this, then it kind of allows you to have two different kinds of rhythms, and that really brings these, I guess, shakers to life. Because if it's just like a then sometimes it's kind of boring, and it might be up to you to play creatively in order to make that work. But if you kind of have something that's constantly changing the volume, then obviously it's going to make it sound like it's more realistic in some way, right? Sort of, maybe. It's a theory, but take it or leave it. So I've got just a little bit of chorus on this that's on the high end. It's just a touch, and then I'm high passing everything else beyond that. And then what I've done was I kind of just bounced this out and then chose a rhythm that I like, I guess, that kind of felt like I fit towards the thing. And then as the processing goes, I've got a saturator on here. This is my default saturator. I just turn the low pass filter down and then pull the drive up to -4.8. I don't really touch anything else. There's a little bit of chorus right here. I've got some ring mod on here, and then I've got a little bit of a Haas effect to give it some stereo. So the next thing that I've done is I've got a phase plant kind of little bloop thing. This is literally just like a bass patch, the same bass patch that I made just pre. So I added the same filter and did the same kind of processing on here. You'll see that it's almost the exact same, but I kind of just took out the lows and then added some reverb on top of it, and then kind of made sure that it's a little bit over to the right, and that's pretty much it. And I like doing this because it means that these two are going to work well together because they're essentially the same sound, right? So essentially kind of what I did from there was I actually pulled out the piano thing of this, and then I kind of just played along with it. So and I mean, that's kind of the same, I guess, kind of melody that I played, but using the metronome along with that kind of allows me to play a little bit swingy but kind of stay somewhat in time. So instead of having this on every single beat, then I've kind of created just a little bit more of a polyrhythm. So instead of having this go boop, 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 I've kind of created a little bit more of a rhythm with that to kind of allow, I guess, the feel or the vibe of that, if that makes sense. So those are pretty much the only instruments that I have. And the last final thing that I've done is something that you've most likely seen me do before, where I send everything to a reverb channel or an effect rack, as a send, whatever you want to call it. Then on here, I've got everything below 140 taken out, and then some multi-band compression, kind of like this. And that just kind of allows things to not get too loud, but every once in a while I like to do some cool fills that kind of swell up with reverb, and you can see that I've kind of just left the turnaround for that. If we listen right here, you can kind of hear it a little bit more. And it's subtle. It doesn't need to be huge. And you can, well, I mean, you can make it as big as you want, but for me, it's pretty subtle. And that's kind of all I really did for that particular thing. So finally, on this group right here, I've got the final processing and stuff. This is kick. This is a snare. I change the way I do sidechaining all the time, but I have a little bit of an OTT, 50%, I guess, some clipping on the rest of the group. There is a tool right here that I was initially turning things down, but I don't think that I'm actually using that now, so that's pretty much it. Then on my master channel, I just have a limiter that's kind of making this a little bit louder. Now, obviously, ideally, you would want these peaks to kind of match everything else, but because there's not a constant sound of noise, like, it kind of makes the mixing a little bit strange anyways. And of course, like, this is a basic way to create a beat. But once you have something like that all set up, then you can kind of mess around with it. And you can see that you can get a lot of fun just by kind of combining those things. And that's kind of one thing that I've been having a lot of fun with doing as far as actually owning a MIDI controller, especially one like this, because I can kind of swap interfaces out and such. Like if I want to do the pads, then I can do that. If I want to switch this over and play keys with the same MIDI controller, that makes things a lot easier for me. But I kind of feel like one of the beautiful things about halftime music is kind of that vibe of like using an old sampler and actually like kind of drum in the beat yourself, right? And it's not to say that you have to by any means, but that's kind of how this beat came together and started working for me. So thank you to SENSEL for sending me this, and this has been a lot of fun to make. Hopefully you guys learned something. There aren't really a lot of halftime beat tutorials out there, and so I kind of wanted to provide something that was hopefully a little bit somewhat informative and have a little bit of quality to it, even though of course it's not the best. But if you guys like this video, then let me know. Also, if you are a member, send me a message on Discord and I will send you this project. Sound good? Sound good. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, YouTube members, I don't care what tier of membership you are. I just want to give something back since people have been sending me things, and I want to make sure that the community feels rewarded. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys. Let me know in the comments if you got any questions or anything, and I will see you in the next one.